When it comes to Disney movies, Wreck-It Ralph actually still stands strong as one of my modern Disney favorites, a true classic that will always be remembered and cherished, where its sequel remains to be a complete pile of trash that will continue to age badly with each passing day. Because that is a film that began a new tradition of having no films with villains for Disney, and one that they probably regret nowadays with the middling reception that the company has cultivated. But just before this era was something everyone now knows as Disney's twist villain era. Disney villains who weren't expected to be villains at all from the start, and were just shoved in at the near end of the film just because. And each one, looking back on it from Frozen to Zootopia, really didn't work, and that's been well documented at this point. But that doesn't mean they were incapable of doing so, because they have already done so in the past, and I've already highlighted this myself with 3 of them that actually did work in my previous video. Were actually, funny enough, this era of Disney's horrible twist villains were actually started with one of the greats that I mentioned earlier in Turbo, or King Candy himself, from Wreck-It Ralph. A villain who literally spawned this new era of Disney twist villains and was their last great villain to date. And as you may have guessed by my title, I am going to focus on his very character and why he was such a great twist villain, and of course villain in general, in more detail than I did before, who really set a high standard that Disney wanted to do but ultimately failed with changing stories like Frozen, where Hans was really not the intended villain from the start. But in the case of King Candy here, we already clearly know that he was the intended villain from the very beginning of the film, where the real twist was the fact he was Turbo himself, amongst other minor things for the main characters. Because this is where we have to go back to the basics regarding villains, where there must be a clear and present threat for the hero to go through in their journey towards the very start and the very end of the film. And in the case of Wreck-It Ralph, our main hero is actually the villain of his game that he is a part of, a kind of a unique way to demonstrate that this film is all about its twist from the very get-go. Because this is where we learn what the film is about, being the story of Ralph being discontent with not being recognized for who he is as a person, and wants to be the good guy of the story now, which cannot happen because that is something that goes against the programming that they were designed for as characters. And if someone were to actually do that, then the game would actually get shut down as a result, as we find out through the actions of Turbo himself, where every character at the beginning refers to such rogue elements for video game characters as going turbo because of what he did out of jealousy. Because his background comes from the fact he was a beloved main character of his very own racing game that came out during the beginnings of the arcade, loving the spotlight for who he was until a newer racing game actually came out with better graphics. And because of this, he got angry and lost the spotlight, and sort of actually destroyed the other game in the process to get that spotlight back, getting both his and the new one unplugged as a result, destroying all life that actually came with it. And it's all done to set up the world as is, where you can't go beyond who you are, where if you are a villain, you will always be a villain, and vice versa for others in that very situation. But the more you do it, like what Ralph has done for 30 years at this point, the more tired you actually get of it, where from the perspective of Ralph here, you get tired of being undervalued just because you're virtually the bad guy that no one likes or appreciates. His main motivation as a character is actually to be loved by all. Yes, he is a bad guy, but that's just his job, where he really is a good guy underneath after hours, just like anyone else who's actually played a role that most people hate on the surface but are complete opposites as humans themselves, which sets him up on the get-go to go turbo in this situation, following somewhat in his footsteps. The difference here for him is that it's not out of spite or jealousy like he did, but just to be appreciated by those for his worth as a character overall for the Fix-It Felix game, which of course is still wrong to do with what happens to the games as a result, as he ends up in another video game and gets swiped by Vanellope, where he has to get the medal back he earned from Hero's Duty, which ends up in the hands of King Candy, who we all know is Turbo in this case. And this is truly where the great twist begins for his character, besides what we will eventually know, all because of the way he's actually presented. He is supposedly the ruler of Sugar Rush, and he likes to keep order in his game from any glitches like Vanellope or Wreck-It Ralph actually barging him for some reason, where it really sets him to act a bit antagonistic towards him, knowing what actually could happen, which makes total sense. This is great for the reason we've already established in the villainous character towards our main hero in some way, and the subtle hints to his character that becomes more erratic to any glitches that disrupts the system that he imposes as that very ruler. And it's something we should compare to Frozen that came out next year after this very film, with Hans, who has none of those hints or intent to be that way until the very end of the film. How in this case the twist is hardly earned because it wasn't set up unless you look at it from certain details that the film presented, but still getting overshadowed by how helpful he is towards the main character from the beginning almost to the end, where he just dropped it like a flick of a switch. Nothing earned in that department because it wasn't very clear from the start, unlike what we are shown here. And that's why King Candy here has the upper hand, because he's clearly against characters like Vanellope from the get-go, and Ralph to a certain degree, even though he tries to convince him otherwise throughout. That we see he sets demands as king no matter what, where no matter the case, Vanellope should not be able to enter the race at all or gain any help from Wreck-It Ralph. So besides the main twist twist of his character, we at the very least know he is the villain of the story at this point, or leading to be that way at the very end to satisfy the opposite end of our heroes in that case and going against what we know and what they're actually planning. Because the major problem that faces Disney twist villains is the presentation of the character, mainly being set up as overall good figures that you can trust but suddenly turned against others for various reasons. Like that is what literally Hans, Callahan, and Bellwether had for the most part that worked against them as villains. But this isn't also to say it's a very bad thing, or it's reason why they suck for the most part because they're presented as good, but it's more of how they're constantly trying to be presented as such that makes them suck from the beginning to the very end. Because going back to my previous video, the other villains that I mentioned in Rourke and John Silver were actually shown to be good at first on the surface, but then actually revealed later on. The difference here is what the characters actually had that gradually convinced you that they were deserving of that role overall with what they did. How it's shown to you in various conversations and animated expressions in the background of our main protagonist. How you can either present them secretly on screen having villainous intent and whatnot from the others that you know it's wrong for them, that makes you understand more of their role and the stakes that the film presents. And that's why King Candy was also very good at it on a surface view, being presented to Ralph and his worldview entirely. And because of that, we get to see this villainy part fully revealed when he retrieves the Hero's Duty Medal as a bargaining chip for Ralph to actually stop Vanellope from joining the race, manipulating him to believe that she would die if she were to rejoin and so forth, to drill into him that what he does is right for the sake of it, giving what he desired for in the first place, while still letting us know that he is of course the villain that Ralph actually shouldn't trust at all. And that's why the others failed as a result, because they didn't showcase any of that at all, where Hans presented himself as the comical villain at the last moment who actually made his plans much more harder to accomplish and much more stupider than needed to be because it wasn't designed that way at all from the beginning. And how Callahan was trying to be presented as a sympathetic villain because he lost his daughter and was actually kind to Hero and his brother from the very start, but also never warranted turning against them for his vengeance plans. I get what they were trying to portray with the grief he was going through, but then again the film constantly presents Alistair Cray and his company as the actual main villain from the start of what he wanted to do with the microbots that made more sense because of what they already show with the choice Hero actually makes from the start. How it's just more thrown out there instead for Yokai and Callahan, where his motivations really don't make sense overall with how he treated others like Hero and Tadashi afterwards, where how he actually treated him trying to save him as just his mistake for being there. How he just throws away other people's lives just because of what he lost personally that actually got found in the end, and that doesn't make any sense. And finally, just how Bellwether was actually dragged into that at the very last second. I mean, it tries to make sense for what they tried to do in that department in the story that they were trying to present, but they never really took the time to actually build up to that point or have her dislike where she is to reveal something more for her character. Just a regular person content with what she has and actually helping others like Judy accomplish her very goals, where they just reveal at the literal tail end of the movie that she was the villain from the start, where it just really didn't work at all because you hardly remember her character at all. Like, if you ask anybody who's casually watched the film, they will not be able to name her at all or tell you who the villain is in that case, because they never actually did anything to upset the balance or instill doubt in the main character themselves with what they represented. The main reason why they work is how they can actually coerce them in the moment to actually doing something for them that you might think is right, but actually benefits the villain instead and actually sets back the hero, which is exactly what King Candy actually did in this situation, where Ralph thought he had no choice but to destroy her car to actually save her as a result, when that actually wasn't true, where he found out later himself that she was actually a racer on the side of the game. Another twist that actually works because he found out he was being manipulated himself into believing this, and to us to a certain extent, and how we can connect the dots back to every single point to his character that actually made sense for him to do this with the position he has now that is actually being threatened once again when the main characters come back to make amends with each other. This is where the moment where the real twist is finally revealed out of all of it that makes his character the best of his very type, where Vanellope actually glitches and shows slowly but surely, revealing that King Candy is actually Turbo himself, the man who actually started the background events we've known in the entire movie up until this point. Because before this, most thought of him as actually being dead because of what he did to shut down the games in the past where every character would have been erased. But in this moment, we secretly find out that he hid himself from doing so and entered the game as a result. It works because it was earned from this point with the hints we've gotten and the characters in the film that was being designed for, where it all makes sense now of why he never wanted Vanellope to enter the race, because she would be a part of the game and he would be out with what he built because he was not part of the game, unlike what Vanellope is described as a glitch throughout. How we now know from the start, he took many years to devise a plan that would become a part of the top again, represented by coming King of Sugar Rush, where everyone would actually care about him again in this cutesy game and wouldn't be replaced by other kings because of what it actually represented. And this is all done to actually understand how King Candy himself is the antithesis of Ralph in this moment. He was the hero of his game, but actually turned out to be the villain in the story behind the scenes, where our personal journey with Ralph actually showed that he was the villain of his game who was actually the hero in secret instead. How this film gradually led us to this point to showcase two opposites of how heroes and villains actually work, and how they can be properly twisted if they allow the story to be developed. And it's very sad for the most part that Hans and Callahan actually had that traits in common with their heroes and Anna and Hero, but just had their stories left out in that process, like they actually showed for Turbo right here. They had the ingredients in front of them, but they actually refused to see it and actually develop it along the way, and refused to actually have the villains they intended from the very beginning in the roles like Elsa and Alistar Gray, how they needed to be developed from the beginning to actually really work. It's just that you need to have intention from the start, and that's how a story actually works, and if you don't have that, then the story kind of suffers. These films aren't particularly bad as a result, but it's just how their true potential as stories were actually squandered by what they actually produced in the actual film. But back to this film, he finally gets quickly defeated at this point with what she has and what we already know that he had against her, which was actually well rewarded, where this time the final twist came in the form of his final form being transformed into a Cybug hybrid, a kind of tribute to the final boss of a video game that this film has. And I like to look at it as this way, as the final twist to his character, because it's the final attempt for him to try to win, that all gloves are now off, that he's revealed that he doesn't care what happens at this point to the main characters, where he statistically tries to torture Ralph to see Vanellope die and then eventually kill him in this new form. That when the twist is finally revealed for the main characters, the villain actually acts more irrational and becomes more insane in most cases, like Rourke and like Clayton, to actually achieve their final goals that was actually stopped in some way right before the final fight. It reveals more to their character to the audience about how they actually were, and solidifies their role as the villain before they get defeated, because they were built up to that point and trying to secretly hide those points from the main heroes. Where in this case, Ralph is actually successful in exploding the soda volcano and actually saved by Vanellope, where as a result of this, the programming of the Cybugs, they actually go straight to the light and disintegrate, and how this also affects Turbo in that case because of what he became himself that compelled him before he screamed as death actually surrounded him, a fitting end to all the lies he caused for everyone throughout the years. So as we can see, Turbo is truly a perfect twist villain because of how he's already presented in the traditional sense at first, but then revealed to be the person who actually caused the events surrounding the film at the very beginning. How he is the clear threat from the get-go and treated as such throughout the film that makes his villainy actually work for the better. The main lesson that should be taken away here is the fact of development. How you can actually work from beginning to end with your hero to see it through, where the story can actually work with what is being presented forward. But if you don't do that, then you leave more questions about the film than answers that actually satisfy the journey, where it also showcases how you clearly remove your intended villains from the roles because of what you liked about them to fit the story, but disregard the other elements so you can finish a deadline and also capitalize off of this new trend of villainy. Because for some reason after this film, Disney actually couldn't get their villains right at all and just straight up removed them from the story, or just hint at one then revealed she wasn't actually the villain at all in a poorly done story with a poorly done message. But all in all, for the most part, Wreck-It Ralph is a film that should be praised for what it had in its story that worked out on all fronts and cherished our love of gaming. That if Disney ever wanted to dive more into this front of villainy ever again, then maybe make steps towards this one. Because now it truly remains to be a pinnacle of how to do a modern twist villain right, and a modern villain in general. One actually done with motivations and development that characters actually can go on. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.